The floorboards of the Dust Creek Bank groaned under the weight of a silence thick with dust and desperation. Outside, the Arizona sun hammered the world into a shimmering mirage, but inside the air was cool and still smelling of aging paper and oiled steel. Cole Mercer stood before the teller's cage, his hat held respectfully in his hands, feeling as out of place as a storm cloud in a clear sky. It had been nearly a year since he'd last set foot in the town's only financial institution, a place he associated with endings, not beginnings. The teller, a young man named Peterson, with a wispy mustache and nervous eyes, counted out the meager withdrawal. $50, Mr. Mercer. That'll see you through the dry season, I hope. It'll have to, Cole, said his voice, a low rumble, rusty from disuse. He folded the bills carefully, his scarred knuckles moving with a slow deliberation that belied the speed they once possessed. He was a man built of long, hard lines, his face a roadmap of sun-scorched trails and battles fought in shadow. At 53, his quiet life, on a small, dusty patch of land, was a self-imposed penance for a past written in gunpowder and blood. He was turning to leave when the world exploded. The bank's front windows shattered inward, spraying glass like shrapnel across the polished floor. A woman screamed a high, thin sound that was brutally cut short. Cole reacted without thinking, years of instinct taking over. He dropped, hitting the rough wood planks, the impact jarring his bones. He tasted dust and fear. He saw the boot's first worn leather, caked in the red dust of the high desert, moving with predatory confidence. Then the gun's long-barreled Colts that seemed to suck the very light from the room. 4 masked men filled the small space, their voices sharp and cold. Nobody moves. Nobody gets hurt. This is a robbery. Cole kept his head down, his cheek pressed against the floor. He was just a ranch hand, a quiet man trying to be forgotten. The last thing he needed was to play the hero. He made himself small, invisible, just another terrified citizen caught in the crossfire of other men's greed. The leader of the gang, a man who moved with a chilling grace, vaulted over the counter. He wore a dark duster and a black bandana that covered the lower half of his face, but his eyes, visible above the cloth, were chips of ice. They held no heat, no mercy, only a profound and terrifying emptiness. The safe old man, the leader, said, his voice a cultured baritone that was strangely at odds with the violence of his actions. He pressed the muzzle of his pistol against the temple of the bank manager, Mr. Abernathy, a portly man whose face had gone the color of old parchment. I can't, Abernathy stammered, sweat beading on his bald head. It's on a time lock. It won't open until noon. The leader, Silas Kane, though Cole didn't know his name, then sighed with theatrical disappointment. A time lock. How very modern, and how very inconvenient. He cocked the hammer of his pistol, the sound of final metallic click in the suffocating silence. You see, I am a man on a schedule. Your lack of foresight has created a wrinkle in my day. Without another word, he pulled the trigger. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. Mr. Abernathy collapsed behind the counter, a neat dark hole appearing in his starched white shirt. A collective gasp went through the room, followed by muffled sobs. Cole's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a robbery. It was an execution. This was a man who killed not out of necessity, but out of impatience. Silas Kane's men moved efficiently, stuffing bags with the cash from the teller drawers. It wasn't much, but they worked with a practiced speed that suggested this was not their first such enterprise. Silas, meanwhile, calmly walked back around the counter, his boots crunching on the shattered glass. He scanned the faces of the terrified customers on the floor, his icy gaze lingering on each one for a moment, as if memorizing them for some future purpose. His eyes passed over Cole without a flicker of recognition. To him, Cole was just another broken-down rancher, a piece of the scenery. The irony was a bitter pill. 20 years ago, men like Silas Kane would have crossed the street to avoid Cole Mercer's shadow. Now he was less than nothing. As Silas turned to leave, his duster swirled. Something metallic slipped from his pocket, falling to the floor with a soft, delicate chime. It landed just inches from Cole's face, spinning on the dusty planks before coming to rest. It was a silver locket tarnished with age, intricately carved with the image of a nesting dove. Cole's breath caught in his throat. His heart, a dormant, stone-cold thing for 15 years, hammered against his ribs with the force of a physical blow. He knew that locket. He knew the precise weight of it in his palm, the feel of the tiny clasp under his thumb. He knew the way the light caught the dove's eye. He had given an identical one to his wife Mary on the day their daughter Sarah was born. He had watched her fasten it around her neck, a promise of love and family that had been brutally broken by fever and an early grave. It was the last thing he'd seen her wear before he'd left on the cattle drive from which he returned a widower and a broken man. The world outside the locket faded away. The shouts of the robbers, the whimpers of the customers, the acrid smell of gunpowder. It all became a distant hum. There was only the silver dove staring up at him from the floor, a ghost from a life he had buried so deep he'd thought it could never be unearthed. Silas Kane and his men were backing toward the door, their guns still trained on the room. "A pleasure doing business with you," Silas said with a chilling politeness. "Do try to be more punctual next time." They were gone. The sudden silence they left behind was more terrifying than the noise had been. For a long moment, no one moved. Then slowly people began to stir their movements, stiff and jerky like puppets with tangled strings. Cole didn't move. His gaze was fixed on the locket. He could feel the past rising up to choke him, the grief he had suppressed for 15 years, clawing at his insides. This object, this impossible echo of his lost life, could not be here. It made no sense. It was a cruel trick of a crueler god. His hand moved a slow, trembling motion. His fingers, clumsy with forgotten emotion, closed around the cool metal. As he lifted it from the floor, the clasp sprang open. Inside, nestled against worn velvet, was not the face of his wife, but a miniature portrait of a woman he had never seen before. She was beautiful with kind eyes and dark, flowing hair. It wasn't Mary, but the locket itself. It was identical. A custom piece from a silversmith in Santa Fe, made from a mold he himself had helped design. There couldn't be another one. The bank door creaked open, and Sheriff Bartlett lumbered in his face, a mask of weary resignation. "Everyone all right in here?" he asked, his voice lacking any real urgency. Cole closed his fist around the locket, the metal biting into his palm. He pushed himself to his feet, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and a rekindled pain so sharp it stole his breath. He had come to Dusk Creek to disappear, to let the gunfighter Cole Mercer die and be forgotten. He had built a fortress of solitude and routine around his broken heart, a quiet gray existence where nothing could touch him. But this locket had just breached his walls. The man who had dropped it, a cold-blooded killer named Silas Kane, was now inextricably, impossibly linked to the deepest tragedy of Cole's life. The quiet was over. The past was no longer buried, and Cole knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he would not rest until he understood why. For 2 days, the locket sat on the rough-hewn table in Cole's cabin, a silent silver accusation. He would stare at it for hours, turning it over and over in his calloused hands, the impossible familiarity of it a constant torment. He tried to reason it away. It was a coincidence, a similar design, a trick of a grief-addled mind. But he knew better. The silversmith in Santa Fe had been an old man, even then his designs unique, his molds destroyed after each creation. There was no other locket like it in the world. His self-imposed exile had been a fragile piece, and now it was shattered. The ghosts he had worked so hard to keep at bay returned with a vengeance. In the long, quiet hours of the desert night, he saw Mary's face, her smile, as he fastened the locket around her neck. He heard Sarah's laughter, a sound he hadn't allowed himself to remember for over a decade. The grief was a physical presence in the small cabin, a suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe. He had tried to outrun his past by becoming a ghost himself, a man without a story, without connections. He mended fences at the Brennan Ranch, his movements slow and methodical, his interactions with others brief and functional. He was the quiet man at the end of the road, the one folks nodded to, but never really knew. It was a safe, empty existence. Now a killer named Silas Kane had dragged him back into the world of violence and mystery. Cole found himself cleaning the Colt Peacemaker he kept wrapped in an oilcloth under a loose floorboard. His hands moved with an old, muscle-deep memory, dismantling and reassembling the weapon with a fluid efficiency that felt both foreign and disturbingly natural. The feel of the cold steel in his hand was like a handshake with a demon he thought he had vanquished. On the third day after the robbery, his world tilted on its axis again. He was returning from the creek, a bucket of water in each hand, when he saw her. A small figure huddled near the old copper mine that bordered his property. At first, he thought she was a mirage, a trick of the heat shimmering off the red rocks. But as he drew closer, the mirage took the form of a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, with a tangle of long black hair matted with dust. Her dress was torn, her feet bare and bleeding. She was watching him with eyes that were too old for her face, dark pools of terror and exhaustion. When he took a step toward her, she bolted like a spooked colt scrambling into the rocks with a desperate agility. "Easy now," Cole called, his voice gentle. "I'm not going to hurt you." He set the buckets down and held up his empty hands. He knew better than to pursue her. She was a wild thing, cornered and terrified. He sat down on a rock, keeping his distance, and waited. The sun beat down, and the silence of the desert pressed in. An hour passed, then another. Finally, drawn by thirst and a pain that must have been overwhelming, she emerged from the rocks, her movements slow and tentative. He led her back to his cabin without a word. He gave her water, which she drank in frantic gulps. He cleaned and bandaged her wounded feet, his large, rough hands surprisingly gentle. She flinched at his touch, but didn't pull away. He gave her his only clean shirt to wear, and prepared what little food he had hardtack softened in milk and jerky he sliced into small, manageable pieces. She ate with a ravenous hunger that spoke of days on her own. She never spoke. She wouldn't tell him her name. She watched his every move, her body tensed, ready to flee at the slightest provocation. He took to calling her Little Bird, for she seemed poised for flight at any moment. Someone had hurt this child, and badly. He saw it in the way she scrambled under the table when a log shifted in the wood stove, in the haunted emptiness of her stare. A protective instinct dormant since Sarah's death stirred within him. This small, broken child had stumbled into his life, and he found he could not turn her away. She was a responsibility he didn't want, but one his conscience would not let him shirk. He saw his own lost daughter in her dark hair, in the way she tilted her head when she was watching him. Caring for her was a strange kind of solace, a painful reminder of all he had lost, yet a reason to be more than the empty shell he had become. Days later, Cole was mending a fence line when he saw 3 riders approaching Dusk Creek. They moved with a purpose that set his teeth on edge. They were hunters. He knew the look, the cold efficiency in their posture. He finished his work and headed back to town, his gut tight with a nameless dread. He found them outside the saloon, their leader a tall man with piercing blue eyes and a cruel twist to his mouth. The man introduced himself as Wade Garrett, a bounty hunter. Looking for someone, Garrett set his eyes scanning Cole's face, cataloging him. Young girl, 8 or 9 years old, dark hair, dark eyes. There's a substantial reward. Cole's blood ran cold, but his expression remained a mask of indifference. Sounds like a special little girl. Oh, she is, Garrett said with a smile that held no warmth. Her daddy's a man named Morrison, Black Jack Morrison, biggest bounty in the territory, $50,000, wanted for murder, robbery, you name it. And he'll do anything to get his little princess back. Garrett unfurled a wanted poster. The face that stared up at Cole was weathered and hard, but the eyes, they were the same dark, intelligent eyes that watched him across his cabin table every morning. Anyone who helps us find the girl gets a piece of the pie. Garrett continued his voice, dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. A man could do a lot with that kind of money. The offer hung in the air, a tempting poison. $50,000. It was a fortune. It was a new life, a real ranch, a way out of the dust and poverty. For a fleeting, shameful moment, Cole considered it. He walked away without a word, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. Back at the cabin, he found Little Bird at the table drawing pictures in the dust with her finger. She looked up when he entered, and the fragile trust she had begun to show him shattered. She saw the conflict in his face, the darkness the bounty hunters had stirred. She knew. He sat down across from her. Little Bird, he said, his voice rough with emotion. There are men in town. They say your father's name is Black Jack Morrison. For the first time she spoke. Her voice was a tiny hoarse whisper, as if it had forgotten how to work. Please. Please what? Please don't let them take me. The words came in a rush. They'll use me. They'll use me to find my papa. And then they'll kill him. Her real name was Emma. Emma Rose Morrison. And her father, she insisted, was not the monster on the posters. He was a good man, a hero who fought against the real villains, corrupt men who used the law as a weapon. The story she told in fragmented sentences, and with tears streaming down her dusty cheeks, was one of justice and betrayal, of a mother murdered for trying to expose a powerful conspiracy. A sharp knock on the door made them both freeze. It was Wade Garrett, his cold smile fixed in place. He'd heard about Cole's house guest. He wanted to see her. Cole blocked the doorway. She's sick. Fever. Garrett's smile tightened. Funny, I just spoke with Doc Harrison. He said the girl he examined was healthy as a horse. The lie had failed. The confrontation was inevitable. Garrett left with a veiled threat promising to return with the sheriff. Cole knew they had to run. As he helped Emma gather her few belongings, the clothes donated by the saloon owner, her small collection of pebbles and feathers, the silver locket slipped from his pocket and fell to the floor. Emma gasped. She picked it up, her small fingers tracing the outline of the nesting dove. Where did you get this? A man dropped it. In the bank. This was my mother's. She whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear. Papa gave it to her. But the man who killed her, he took it. The pieces crashed together in Cole's mind with the force of a landslide. Silas Kane, the ruthless killer from the bank, was the same man who had murdered Emma's mother. The locket wasn't a coincidence. It was a trophy. And now this object of his past grief and this child of a desperate present were bound together by the same thread of violence. He looked at Emma, this small, brave girl clutching the last remnant of her mother, and the choice became clear. $50,000 was the price of a man's soul. Redemption, he was beginning to realize, was priceless. "We leave tonight," he said, his voice firm with a purpose he hadn't felt in 15 years. The gunfighter he had tried to bury was stirring not for revenge or money, but for something far more important: to protect an innocent child from a world that wanted to destroy her. They rode north into the teeth of the desert, two fugitives under a canopy of scattered, indifferent stars. Emma, wrapped in one of Cole's old coats, rode the gentlest of his horses, a calm bay gelding named Biscuit. Cole rode Belle, a sturdy buckskin mare who knew the treacherous language of the trail as well as he did. Behind them, the faint lights of Dusk Creek were swallowed by the immense breathing darkness. Ahead lay a brutal wilderness and the men who hunted them. Emma had a destination. A hand-drawn map her father had made her memorize, leading to an abandoned mine in the foothills of the Dragoon Mountains. It was a designated safe place, a place he would check for her if they were ever separated. It was their only hope. As they rode, Cole began the grim education of survival. He taught her how to read the stars for direction, how to listen for the subtle sounds of the desert night, how to stay low in the saddle to present a smaller target. She was a quick study, absorbing his lessons with a solemn intensity that broke his heart. She was a child forced to learn the lessons of a soldier. "My papa," she said, her voice small against the whisper of the wind, "he taught me to read and write. He used to be a teacher. He said education was the one thing no one could ever take from you." The image of Blackjack Morrison as a school teacher clashed violently with the murderous villain on the wanted poster. Emma's stories painted a picture of a reluctant rebel, a man driven to outlawry by a corrupt system that had stolen land and lives under the color of law. He had robbed the robbers, she explained, returning the money to the families who had been swindled by a powerful, ruthless man. Their first day on the trail brought them face to face with the brutal reality of their flight. A different group of hunters, not Garrett's professionals, but a rough band of local opportunists drawn by the scent of the massive bounty, ambushed them at a watering hole. They were harder, meaner men, their eyes devoid of anything but greed. Cole's instincts, honed by years of violence and buried under 2 decades of peace, roared back to life. There was no time for thought, only action. He pushed Emma into the cover of a rocky arroyo as the first shots rang out. The familiar thunder of his Colt, the acrid smell of gunpowder, the deadly dance of cover and fire. It was a language his body had never forgotten. The gunfight was short and brutal. When the silence returned, 4 men lay dead in the dust. Cole stood over them, his hands shaking, not from fear, but from the sickening ease with which the killer had reawakened within him. He felt like a stranger in his own skin, and the peaceful rancher and the lethal gunfighter warring for control of his soul. Emma emerged from the rocks, her face pale but her gaze steady. She looked at the bodies, then at Cole's tormented expression. She walked over and took his trembling hand. "Papa says sometimes good men have to do bad things to protect the ones they love." She whispered her words a balm on his raw conscience. "He says it hurts their hearts, but they do it anyway." They pushed on deeper into the mountains. The pursuit was relentless. They saw the distant dust clouds of Garrett's posse and heard the baying of their tracking hounds on the wind. Cole was forced to use every trick he knew, doubling back on their trail, using rocky ground to hide their tracks, traveling through narrow canyons where the echoes would disguise the sound of their horses. Days blurred into a haze of exhaustion, fear, and grim determination. They ate sparingly, slept in short, fitful bursts, and spoke little. A bond formed between them, forged in shared danger and unspoken understanding. He was no longer just a protector. He was the only thing she had left in the world. And she, in turn, was becoming the reason for his continued existence, a fragile flame of innocence he had to shield from the howling darkness. Finally, after a week of running, they found at the Esperanza mine, its entrance hidden behind a carefully arranged rockfall, just as Emma's map had shown. Fresh horse tracks marked the entrance. Someone was here. "Papa," Emma cried, her voice echoing in the canyon. A weak voice answered from the darkness within. "Emma, little star, is that you?" They found him deep inside the mine by the light of a small sputtering fire. It was Blackjack Morrison. He was pale and feverish, his arm bound in a crude sling, a dark, angry-looking bullet wound seeping through the bandage. But his eyes, so like his daughter's, lit up as she threw herself into his one good arm. Blackjack looked at Cole, his hand instinctively moving toward his pistol. "Who's this?" "He saved me," Papa, Emma said, her voice muffled against his chest. "He's a good man." Morrison studied Cole, his gaze sharp and intelligent, despite the pain and fever. "Mercer," he said, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Cole Mercer. I know that name. You rode the hard trails." "That was a long time ago," Cole said, lowering his rifle. Over the next hour, the truth finally came out. Blackjack Morrison was no outlaw. He was U.S. Marshal Jackson Morrison, working undercover to expose a vast conspiracy of land fraud and murder, orchestrated by powerful figures, a network that reached from the Arizona Territory all the way back to Washington. His wife Sarah had been his partner gathering evidence. Silas Kane, the man with the locket, was the conspiracy's chief enforcer. He had murdered Sarah not during a robbery, but to silence her and steal the evidence she carried. The $50,000 bounty was a lie, a tool to turn the entire territory into a hunting party, to eliminate the one man who could bring them all down. "The evidence," Blackjack whispered, his voice growing weaker. "Sarah hid it. Some of it is here. The rest, Emma knows." He looked at his daughter with a father's desperate love. "She's the key. She's the living witness." He entrusted Cole with a charred ledger proof of the conspiracy's financial crimes and a small brass key to a safety deposit box in Tucson. But his greatest charge was Emma herself. As the fever consumed him, Blackjack's life ebbed away. He died at dawn, holding his daughter's hand, his last breath a whisper of her name. Cole and Emma buried him in a shallow grave at the back of the mine, marking the spot with a simple cross of stones. The mission was now Cole's. He was no longer just protecting a child. He was the guardian of a federal investigation, the keeper of a dead man's promise. He now understood the full, terrifying scope of the conspiracy. Silas Kane wasn't just a killer. He was a cleaner, systematically eliminating anyone who knew the truth. And Emma was his final target. Cole looked at the little girl who stood stoically before her father's grave, her small shoulders bearing a weight no child should ever have to carry. The time for running was over. He had tried to escape his past to bury the gunfighter, but his past had found him. He now had to embrace the very skills he despised, not for redemption, but for justice. He had to become Cole Mercer again, not the killer, but the lawman he had once been, to finish the fight that Jackson Morrison had started. Their sanctuary became a trap. Cole knew Silas Kane would eventually track them to the mine. The man was too methodical, too relentless to give up. Their only hope was to get the evidence to the proper authorities before Kane found them. Blackjack had spoken of a single trustworthy contact, a federal judge in Prescott. But Prescott was 100 miles away, across territory crawling with Kane's men and bounty hunters still hungry for the phantom reward. "We need a better plan," Cole said, studying the charred ledger by the firelight. "We can't outrun him forever." Emma, who had been quietly sketching in a corner with a piece of charcoal on a flat stone, looked up. "Papa had another place, a ghost town, Weaver's Creek." He said if everything went wrong, a friend would meet him there on the 15th of the month. Today's the 14th, Cole said, his mind racing. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble based on a dead man's plan. But it was better than waiting to be slaughtered. Who is this friend? I don't know, Emma admitted. Papa just called him the professor. He said he was a man who believed in books and the truth. They prepared to leave, packing what little food and water remained. As Cole secured the ledger in his saddlebags, he noticed a detail he'd missed before. Tucked into a leather fold was a faded photograph. It showed a younger, happier Blackjack Morrison standing beside another man, both of them grinning, wearing the uniforms of Union cavalry officers. The other man. Cole felt a jolt of recognition. It was Silas Kane. He looked different, younger, without the cold emptiness in his eyes, but it was unmistakably him. They had known each other. They had fought on the same side. This was more than a conspiracy about land and money. This was personal. Their journey to Weaver's Creek was a descent into a sun-blasted hell. The desert was unforgiving, and they were low on water. By midday they were ambushed. Not by Kane, but by Wade Garrett and his 2 remaining men. They had been patient, tracking them from a distance, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The fight was in a narrow, rocky canyon. Garrett was smart. He pinned them down using the terrain to his advantage. Cole was forced into a deadly game of cat and mouse, using his knowledge of the land to counter Garrett's professional tactics. During a lull in the fighting, Garrett's voice echoed off the canyon walls. "Give me the girl, Mercer. I don't want to kill you, but the money's too good to pass up." "The bounty's a lie," Garrett Cole shouted back. "Morrison was a U.S. Marshal." "I don't care if he was the president," Garrett retorted. "His poster pays $50,000. That's the only truth I need." The fight resumed, desperate and close. Cole managed to take down one of Garrett's men, but took a bullet in the process, a searing line of fire across his ribs. Wounded and outgunned, he knew they were finished. Then Emma did something extraordinary. While Cole drew their fire, she scrambled up a hidden path her father had shown her, a treacherous goat trail that led to a ledge high above the bounty hunters. Armed with a small pistol Cole had given her and a pouch full of rocks, she created a diversion. She didn't fire the gun, but the hail of stones from above, combined with the echoing report of a single shot she fired into the air, was enough to make Garrett's remaining man think they were being flanked. He broke cover, and Cole's shot was true. Now it was just Garrett. The professional hunter was cornered. He surrendered, throwing down his guns, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "You've been chasing a ghost?" Garrett Cole said, breathing heavily, his side on fire. "Kane played you." They left the bounty hunter tied securely with enough water to last until someone found him. The encounter had cost them precious time and left Cole wounded, but they pressed on toward the ghost town of Weaver's Creek. They arrived as a malevolent, yellow-tinged dusk began to fall. Weaver's Creek was a skeleton of a town, its buildings sagging and broken, bleached by the sun and scoured by the wind. A profound silence hung over the place, the silence of death and decay. As they rode down the main street, a dust storm was gathering on the horizon, a bruised purple wall of sand and wind rolling toward them. A single lantern glowed in the window of the old assay office. This had to be the place. Cole dismounted, his movement stiff from his wound, his rifle held ready. He pushed open the door. A man sat at a desk, a book open before him. He was older, with spectacles and a neat gray beard. "The Professor?" Cole asked. The man looked up and smiled, but the smile was wrong. It was cold and familiar. As he stepped out of the shadows, Cole's blood froze. It was Silas Kane. "Welcome, Marshal Morrison," Kane said, his voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "Or should I say, welcome, Cole Mercer? It seems we have both been hunting the same ghosts." The door slammed shut behind them. Kane's men emerged from the shadows of the decaying buildings, their guns trained on Cole and Emma. They were trapped. The professor wasn't a friend. He was the traitor. Blackjack's last hope had been a lie. The dust storm hit Weaver's Creek with the force of a physical blow. The wind shrieked like a banshee, tearing at the rotten wood of the buildings and flinging sand with such velocity it stung like 1,000 tiny needles. Visibility dropped to near zero. The world became a maelstrom of howling wind and choking yellow dust. Inside the assay office, Silas Kane was the calm at the center of the storm. "It's fitting, don't you think," he said, his voice barely audible above the gale, "that it should all end here, in a place forgotten by God and man." Cole stood between Kane and Emma, his body a shield, his mind racing. His side throbbed with a dull, insistent fire, and he knew he was running out of time. "What do you want, Kane?" "What do I want?" Kane laughed, a dry, mirthless sound. "I want what's mine. I want justice." He gestured to Emma. "Her father was a thief and a murderer. He took everything from me." "He was a lawman," Cole growled. "He was exposing you." "Exposing me?" Kane's eyes glittered in the lantern light. "He created me." He reached into his coat and pulled out the silver locket, dangling it from its chain. "Do you know what this is, Mercer? It's a memory. It belonged to my younger brother, Daniel." He opened the locket. The portrait inside was not of Emma's mother. It was of a fresh-faced young man with hopeful eyes. "Daniel wasn't a killer or a thief," Kane said, his voice trembling with a rage that was decades old. "He was a rancher. A good man. He had a wife and a baby daughter on the way. And 15 years ago, in a saloon in New Mexico, a gunfighter looking to make a name for himself shot him down in cold blood over a card game. The world spun under Cole's feet. New Mexico. A card game. A young rancher who wouldn't back down. The memory, buried under years of whiskey and regret, surfaced with horrifying clarity. He had been drunk arrogant, a man trying to fill the hollow void left by his family's death with pointless violence. "That gunfighter, Kane's voice was a blade of ice, was you, Cole Mercer." Cole stared at Kane, the photograph of the two of them in uniform flashing in his mind. They had been brothers in arms, fighting for a cause. And Cole, in his grief-fueled rage, had destroyed Kane's family, just as his own had been destroyed. "I spent years looking for you." Kane continued, his composure cracking, revealing the raw wound beneath. "But you disappeared. Became a ghost. Then I heard about your friend Jackson Morrison, a federal marshal making trouble for my new business partners. And when I saw his file, I saw his connection to you. I knew if I squeezed him hard enough, you would eventually surface. My entire criminal enterprise, this web of corruption, it was all just bait. Bait to draw out the man who murdered my brother." The revelation was staggering. This was never about land or money. It was about revenge. Cole was not fighting a greedy criminal. He was facing the monster he had helped create. He was staring into the eyes of a man whose soul he had personally destroyed. "The locket," Cole whispered, his voice hoarse. "Why?" "It was the only thing Daniel had on him when he died," Kane said. "A gift for his wife. Your friend Morrison's wife. She looked so much like her. When I took it from her, it felt right. A small piece of poetry in a brutal world." The moral ground crumbled beneath Cole's feet. He was the villain in this story. His past had finally caught up to him, and it was demanding a bloody price. Suddenly, the roof of the assay office groaned under the assault of the wind, and then tore away, sucked into the vortex of the storm. Debris rained down. The lantern was extinguished, plunging them into a swirling, chaotic darkness, lit only by flashes of lightning. In the confusion, Cole shoved Emma toward a collapsed section of the back wall. "Go hide." He turned back to face Kane in the roaring dark. This was no longer a fight for justice. It was a confrontation with his own sins. The gunfight in the heart of the storm was a primal, desperate struggle. Shapes moved in the swirling dust muzzle flashes, giving fleeting, nightmarish glimpses of the battlefield. Cole used his knowledge of the ghost town, remembered from his own days on the run, to his advantage. He moved through the decaying buildings like a phantom, his shots precise and deadly, taking down Kane's men one by one. He was no longer just fighting for Emma. He was fighting for the ghost of Daniel Kane, for the man he had once been, and for the possibility of a future free from the blood on his hands. The final confrontation took place in the skeletal remains of the town church. Lightning illuminated the scene in stark, biblical flashes. Kane and Cole stood at opposite ends of the nave, both wounded, both exhausted, the howling wind their only congregation. "This ends now," Mercer Kane snarled, raising his pistol. "Yes," Cole set his own gun steady. "It does." They fired at the same time. The thunder of the guns was lost in the thunder of the storm. Cole felt a white-hot pain blossom in his shoulder, sending him staggering back. But his own shot had been true. Silas Kane crumpled to the floor, the silver locket falling from his hand and skittering across the broken floorboards. Cole stumbled over to him. Kane was still alive, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked up at Cole, and for the first time, the icy emptiness in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of something else. Understanding. "Daniel." "He was all I had left," Kane whispered. "I know," Cole said, the weight of his own loss pressing down on him. "I'm sorry." As Silas Kane's life faded, the storm outside began to break. The wind's shriek softened to a mournful sigh. A sliver of moonlight pierced the clouds, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the ruined church. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of approaching horses. Federal agents, guided by information from Blackjack Morrison's final desperate telegraph messages, were arriving. They found Cole kneeling beside the body of his enemy, a man who was also his victim. Emma ran to him, her face streaked with dust and tears, and threw her arms around him. The corruption ring was shattered. With Kane dead and the ledger in federal hands, and the entire conspiracy collapsed. Emma's testimony, delivered with a quiet, unshakable dignity, was the final nail in the coffin. She became a key witness, her bravery celebrated in newspapers across the territory. Blackjack Morrison was honored posthumously as a hero, a martyr for justice. Cole, cleared of any wrongdoing and recognized for his heroism, was offered his old life back, a badge, a horse, and the respect of the U.S. Marshal Service. But he had found a different purpose. Months later, after the trials had ended and the dust had truly settled, Cole formally adopted Emma. Their journey took them not to a new town or a new job, but to a small, windswept cemetery in New Mexico. 2 simple wooden crosses marked the graves of Mary and Sarah Mercer. Cole stood before them for a long time, the wind tugging at his coat. He had avoided this place for 15 years, unable to face the ghosts of his greatest failure. Now, with Emma's small hand in his, he was finally ready. He took out the 2 silver lockets, and the one he had given his wife, which he had carried all these years, and the one that had belonged to Daniel Kane, which he had recovered from the church. He placed his wife's locket on her grave. Then he walked to his daughter's headstone. He looked at the tarnished silver dove in his palm, the object that had started this journey of blood and redemption. It was a symbol of his sin, of the life he had taken, and the monster he had created. With a quiet reverence, he placed Silas Cain's locket on Sarah's grave. It was an offering, an apology, a prayer for two lost brothers. It was an act of peace, a final forgiveness, not just for his own sins, but for the sins of a man driven to darkness by a grief Cole understood all too well. He was no longer running from his past, but honoring the lessons it had taught him. As he and Emma walked away from the graves, hand in hand, the sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of hope and promise. He was not Cole Mercer, the haunted gunfighter seeking redemption in violence. He was Cole Mercer, a father, a man who had found his salvation, not in the cold steel of a gun, but in the fierce, unwavering love for a child who had saved him as much as he had saved her.